There is a moment most people recognize. You are lying in bed, the room is dark, and your body is exhausted. But your mind is running through a conversation you had 3 days ago. You are analyzing what you said, what they meant, what you should have said instead. You are planning tomorrow while simultaneously replaying yesterday. You are building arguments for situations that will never happen and solving problems that do not yet exist. And the strangest part is that you are not choosing to do this. It is simply happening to you. This is not a personality flaw. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense. This is something much more structural, something built into the way your brain processes uncertainty. And once you understand what is actually happening beneath the surface, the experience of overthinking starts to look completely different. Most people treat overthinking as a thinking problem. They tell themselves to stop, to relax, to just let it go. And that advice fails every single time, not because the person lacks willpower, but because the advice is aimed at the wrong target. Overthinking is not primarily a thinking problem. It is a threat detection problem. And to understand why that distinction matters, you have to look at what the brain is actually doing when it enters that loop. The human brain has a fundamental operating system, one that predates language, logic, and rational planning. At its core, the brain's primary job is not to help you succeed. Its primary job is to keep you alive by anticipating danger. This system, largely governed by structures in the limbic region, including the amygdala, is constantly scanning your environment for anything that feels uncertain, unresolved, or threatening. And here is the critical part. To this system, an unresolved social situation triggers the same alarm as a physical threat. An unanswered email and a predator produce similar neurological signals. The brain does not always distinguish between emotional discomfort and actual danger. It simply flags something as unresolved and begins allocating cognitive resources toward resolving it. This is where the loop begins. When you encounter an uncertain situation, your brain does not close the file. It keeps it open. It continues running processing power on it in the background, searching for resolution, looking for the answer that will make the uncertainty go away. Overthinking, at its neurological root, is the brain attempting to achieve closure. It is not weakness. It is the threat detection system doing exactly what it was designed to do, applied to situations that cannot be solved through more thinking. The problem is that most modern stressors are not the kind that thinking can resolve. You cannot think your way out of social ambiguity. You cannot analyze your way into certainty about the future. But the brain keeps trying, because that is its default response to anything that feels unresolved. And the more cognitive energy you pour into an unsolvable loop, the more mentally fatigued you become, without ever reaching the closure the brain was looking for. This is the core exhaustion of overthinking. It is not the content of the thoughts that drains you. It is the futile loop itself. Now consider what modern life has done to this system. The average person in a digitally connected environment is exposed to an enormous volume of unresolved information every single day. Social media feeds present dozens of micro-stressors, comparisons, unfinished conversations, ambiguous social signals, performance metrics, news fragments without context. Each one of these represents a small open loop in the brain's processing system. Each one is a file that the threat detection system flags as unresolved. And unlike the environment the brain evolved to handle, this one never empties. There is always another notification, always another piece of incomplete information. The result is a brain running in a state of chronic low-level alarm, its working memory cluttered with dozens of unresolved cognitive loops at any given time. This state has a direct impact on cognitive function. Working memory, the mental space you use to think clearly, make decisions, and focus attention, has a limited capacity. When that space is consumed by open loops, there is less room for structured thought. Decisions become harder. Attention becomes fragmented. And paradoxically, the mental exhaustion that comes from overstimulation actually increases overthinking because a fatigued brain relies more heavily on default pattern loops rather than deliberate reasoning. You become more reactive, more prone to rumination, less capable of the kind of clear-eyed thinking that could actually help. The cognitive load of modern digital life is not just a productivity issue, it is a neurological one. There is also a layer involving dopamine that most people never consider when thinking about overthinking. Dopamine is commonly associated with pleasure, but its more accurate function is anticipation. Dopamine is released in response to the possibility of a reward, particularly when the outcome is uncertain. This is why unpredictable rewards, like social media likes, are more compelling than predictable ones. The uncertainty itself drives the dopamine response. And overthinking is, in many cases, a dopamine loop disguised as problem solving. When you replay a conversation looking for a better interpretation, when you plan a scenario in precise detail to feel more in control, when you run through every possible outcome of a decision you have not made yet, your brain is chasing the dopamine signal that comes from the possibility of resolution. It feels like productive thinking because it activates the same neural reward pathways. But it is not productive. It is the brain consuming its own processing power to generate the feeling of progress without the reality of it. This is why overthinking is so persistent and so difficult to interrupt through willpower alone. You're not fighting a bad habit. You're fighting a neurologically reinforced loop that produces a mild dopamine signal every time it cycles. The brain has learned to mistake the loop itself for progress, and that misidentification is one of the most significant cognitive distortions that underlies chronic overthinking. There is a psychological concept worth understanding here called the Zeigarnik effect. Named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, it refers to the brain's tendency to remember and fixate on incomplete tasks more than completed ones. Her research found that waiters could perfectly recall every detail of an open order, but forgot it almost immediately after it was fulfilled. The incomplete task occupies mental attention in a way that completed ones do not. This principle operates continuously in daily life. Every commitment you have made mentally but not yet acted on, every conversation you meant to have, every decision you delayed, every plan you have not started, all of these exist as active cognitive loops consuming attention and mental energy. The cluttered, overwhelmed feeling that many working adults and students describe is not simply stress. It is the Zeigarnik effect operating at scale, a mind full of open loops with no clear pathway to closure. Understanding this changes the approach entirely. Rather than trying to stop overthinking through suppression, which is cognitively expensive and rarely effective, the more productive direction involves understanding what the brain actually needs. What the threat detection system is looking for is resolution. It wants the loop closed. And there are two ways to close a loop. You either complete the thing the loop is about, or you deliberately tell the brain that it does not need to continue processing it right now. This second option is not avoidance. It is a structured cognitive strategy. And it is why writing things down works far better than most people expect. When you externalize a thought into a written form, the brain registers it as processed. The loop is not gone, but it is transferred out of working memory into an external system. The threat detection system reduces its activity around that item because the brain no longer needs to hold it actively in consciousness to avoid losing it. This is not productivity advice. This is neurological load management. Another layer worth examining is the relationship between overthinking and identity. Many chronic overthinkers do not just overthink occasionally. They have internalized overthinking as a personality trait, a sign of thoroughness, intelligence, or caring. They say things like, "I'm just a detailed person," or "I can't help that I think deeply about everything." And while these framings are not entirely wrong, they carry a subtle problem. When you attach overthinking to your identity, you stop treating it as a behavioral pattern that can be modified and start treating it as an immovable feature of who you are. This identity attachment actually strengthens the loop. The brain protects and reinforces behaviors that align with your self-concept. If you believe overthinking is who you are, the brain treats it as something to be preserved rather than adjusted. The reframe that tends to produce genuine change is a subtle but important one. Overthinking is not a personality trait. It is a cognitive response pattern. And like all patterns, it is context-dependent, trigger-based, and malleable. People who overthink constantly in one area of their lives often demonstrate calm, decisive thinking in another. A person who spirals about social situations might be completely steady in professional ones. This is evidence that the brain's capacity for calm, efficient processing is present. It is not a global deficiency. It is a pattern activated in specific domains where perceived threat and uncertainty are higher. That distinction matters enormously for how you approach change. The practical direction that emerges from this understanding is not about controlling your thoughts more tightly. It is about reducing the conditions that produce the loop in the first place. That means managing the volume of open loops in your cognitive environment, which involves being deliberate about information consumption, structuring external systems to hold unresolved items so working memory can release them, and building enough psychological safety in uncertain situations that the threat detection system does not need to run continuously. It also means recognizing the dopamine element and understanding that more thinking feels rewarding, but is not always more productive. There are problems where additional thought produces diminishing returns very quickly. And one of the more useful cognitive skills a person can develop is the ability to recognize when that threshold has been crossed. Rest is also mechanistically important here, not as a cliché recommendation, but as a neurological requirement. The brain has a system called the default mode network that is active specifically when you are not focused on a task. This system processes unresolved emotional material, integrates experiences, and consolidates learning. Chronic busyness and constant overstimulation suppress this network. When the brain never gets genuine downtime, it loses its most effective natural tool for closing open loops. What many people call overthinking is sometimes the default mode network attempting to do its processing job in the only quiet moments available, which happen to be at bedtime. The mind races at night not because something is wrong with you, but because that may be the first moment of the day the brain has had to attempt its natural integration process. The experience of overthinking is not irrational. It is a completely predictable response to a brain that is operating in an environment of high uncertainty, high stimulation, and insufficient cognitive rest. Understanding that changes the relationship you have with the experience itself. Rather than fighting the loop with frustration, which adds another layer of cognitive activation, you can approach it with the kind of detached curiosity that actually allows the nervous system to settle. Not because detachment is a trick, but because when the brain registers that the loop is being observed rather than resisted, it gradually reduces the urgency of its own signal. Overthinking is the brain trying to protect you from something it cannot define and cannot resolve through more thinking. When you understand that, the loop does not disappear, but it loses some of its authority. And that, more than any technique or strategy, is where genuine change begins.